They were told American soldiers were demons, monsters who would torture them, abuse them, and leave them to die in ditches. But when 247 Japanese women stepped off the transport ship in San Francisco Bay on September 12, 1945, the enemy didn't break them with violence. They broke them with something far more dangerous: kindness, and chocolate, and smiles that made no sense. These women expected death. Instead, they got hot showers, beds with clean sheets, and soldiers who opened doors for them. By the third day, the whispers had started in the barracks. "We've never seen men like this." What happened next would shatter everything they believed about enemies, about honor, and about themselves. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These true accounts from World War II reveal the humanity hidden beneath the horror of war. The September fog hung thick over San Francisco Bay, turning the world gray and cold. The transport ship cut through the water slowly, its engines groaning like something exhausted. On the deck, 247 Japanese women stood in tight clusters, their hands gripping the rails, their eyes wide with terror. Most were young, between 18 and 30 years old. They had served as nurses, radio operators, translators, and clerks for the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific. Now they wore torn uniforms, their hair matted and dirty, their faces hollow from weeks of poor rations aboard the ship. Some clutched small bags containing everything they owned. Others had nothing at all. The smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel filled the air. Seagulls cried overhead, circling the ship like vultures. Through the fog, the Golden Gate Bridge emerged slowly, its red towers rising like some impossible dream. The women stared at it in silence. None of them had ever seen anything like it. In Japan, most bridges had been bombed to rubble. Here was a bridge that seemed to touch the sky, untouched, perfect, impossible. "They will kill us when we land," whispered Keiko, a 22-year-old nurse from Osaka. Her voice trembled as she spoke to the woman beside her, Yuki, who had worked as a radio operator in the Philippines. Yuki didn't answer. She just stared at the approaching shore, her jaw clenched tight. She had seen what happened to prisoners. She had heard the stories. The propaganda officers had told them again and again. Americans were savages. They would torture Japanese women. They would strip them of dignity. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaited them. The ship's horn blasted 3 times, deep and mournful. The women flinched at the sound. Some began to cry softly. Others whispered prayers to ancestors, asking for strength. A few stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, their minds blank with fear. As the ship docked at the military pier, American soldiers appeared on the dock below. Dozens of them standing in loose formations, smoking cigarettes, talking casually among themselves. The women pressed closer to the rails, staring down at these men they had been taught to fear. But something was wrong. The soldiers weren't snarling, they weren't shouting threats, they weren't even pointing their rifles at the ship. They were just standing there, waiting, some of them laughing at something one of their friends had said. One soldier waved up at the ship, a casual, almost friendly gesture. Keiko grabbed Yuki's arm. "Did you see that?" He waved. "Maybe it's a trick," Yuki whispered back, "to make us feel safe before." She didn't finish the sentence. Neither of them wanted to imagine what came after before. The gangway lowered with a metallic clang. American officers appeared at the top of the ramp, clipboards in hand, calling out orders in English that the women couldn't understand. A translator, a Japanese-American soldier, stepped forward and spoke in their language. "You will exit the ship in single file. You will be processed, given medical checks, and assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention." The women looked at each other, confused. Geneva Convention? What did that mean? Keiko had never heard those words before. Yuki had, but only in whispers, never explained. They began to move, slowly, reluctantly, down the gangway. Each step felt like walking toward an execution. The wood creaked under their feet. The fog swirled around them. And below, the American soldiers waited, watching them descend with expressions that weren't angry, weren't cruel, but something else entirely. Curious, almost gentle. Keiko's foot touched American soil for the first time. She expected to feel horror. Instead, she felt only confusion, because the first soldier she passed smiled at her. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just a smile. And that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon. The women were led into a large white building that smelled of disinfectant and something floral they couldn't identify. Inside, female American nurses waited, their uniforms crisp and clean, their faces calm and professional. This was the first surprise. Women. The Americans had sent women to process them. "Please remove your uniforms and place them in these bags," the translator said. "You will be given clean clothing after your medical examination and shower." Panic rippled through the group. Remove their uniforms? In front of strangers? Keiko felt her face burn with shame. In Japan, modesty was everything. To be seen undressed by strangers was a humiliation worse than death. But what choice did they have? Slowly, reluctantly, they began to undress. Some women turned their backs, trying to hide themselves. Others moved quickly as if speed could somehow erase the shame. The American nurses moved among them with gentle efficiency, offering no judgment, no mockery. They simply handed each woman a white towel and pointed toward the next room. The medical examination was quick but thorough. The nurses checked for wounds, infections, and signs of disease. They wrote notes on clipboards, spoke in soft English to each other, and occasionally smiled reassuringly at the frightened women before them. One nurse noticed Keiko's trembling hands and placed her own hand gently on Keiko's shoulder. "It's okay," the nurse said in English, though Keiko didn't understand the words. But she understood the tone. She understood the kindness in the woman's eyes. Keiko burst into tears. Then came the showers. They were led into a large tiled room where dozens of shower heads lined the walls. Steam filled the air, warm and thick. The translator explained that they should wash thoroughly, that soap would be provided, that they should take as much time as they needed. Soap. Real soap. The women stood frozen, staring at the white bars of soap sitting on small shelves beneath each shower head. They picked them up slowly, as if handling something precious and fragile. The soap was smooth, heavy, and smelled like flowers. Like lilacs in spring. Like a world that hadn't been destroyed by war. Yuki turned the water on and gasped as hot water poured over her. Hot water. Not lukewarm. Not cold. Hot. She hadn't felt hot water in over a year. In the field hospitals where she'd worked, they'd been lucky to have any water at all. Around her, other women were crying as they washed. Some laughed through their tears, the sound high and almost hysterical. Others simply stood under the water, letting it run over their faces, their hair, their bodies, washing away months of dirt and fear and exhaustion. Keiko scrubbed her skin until it turned pink. She washed her hair 3 times, working her fingers through tangles that had seemed permanent. The soap lathered thick and white, and the smell of flowers surrounded her like a dream. She thought of her mother's garden in Osaka, the way the jatsid, or cherry blossoms, had smelled in April before the war came. When they finally emerged, they were given clean undergarments, simple gray dresses, and soft cotton socks. The dresses were plain but clean, and they fit reasonably well. Some women stared at themselves in the mirrors on the wall, hardly recognizing their own reflection. Clean. They looked clean. An older woman named Tomoko touched her own face in the mirror, her eyes wide. "I forgot," she whispered. "I forgot I could look like this." But beneath the relief, beneath the unexpected comfort, a darker feeling stirred. Confusion. Shame. They were supposed to be suffering. They were supposed to be tortured. Instead, they had been given soap and hot water and clean clothes. What kind of enemy does this to their prisoners? They were led into a mess hall that could have fit 300 people. Long tables stretched across the room, each one covered with a clean white cloth. The smell hit them before they even entered. Bread baking, meat cooking, coffee brewing, butter melting. The scent was so rich, so overwhelming, that several women stopped in the doorway, unable to move forward. "Please, take a seat," the translator said. "Lunch will be served." The women shuffled to the tables and sat, their backs rigid, their hands folded in their laps. They looked at each other with wide, frightened eyes. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of trick. Maybe the food was poisoned. Maybe this was the last meal before the torture began. American soldiers in white kitchen uniforms appeared, carrying large trays. They moved down the rows, placing plates in front of each woman. Keiko stared down at her plate and felt her breath catch in her throat. Roast chicken, golden and glistening. Mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy. Green beans. A thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter. And beside the plate, a glass of cold milk and a cup of steaming coffee. She hadn't seen this much food on one plate in 3 years. Around her, the other women sat frozen, staring at their meals. No one moved, no one ate. They just looked at the food as if it might vanish if they blinked. "Please eat," the translator said gently. "It's for you." Still no one moved. Finally, Yuki picked up her fork. Her hand shook as she cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing. The taste exploded on her tongue. Rich, savory, real. She chewed and swallowed, and then she started to cry. That broke the dam. Women all around her began to eat, some slowly and carefully, others frantically, as if the food might be taken away at any moment. Tears streamed down faces as they chewed. Some women laughed between bites, the sound desperate and joyful at the same time. Others ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, their minds unable to process what was happening. Keiko bit into the bread, and the soft texture made her gasp. She had eaten bread made from sawdust and tree bark for the last year of the war. This bread was soft, white, perfect. She spread butter on it with trembling fingers and took another bite. The richness made her dizzy. Across the table, Tomoko was crying so hard she couldn't eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, staring at it, her whole body shaking with sobs. "My children," she whispered. "My children are starving in Tokyo, and I'm eating chicken." The guilt hit all of them at once. While they sat here eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes, their families in Japan were picking through rubble for scraps. Their children were eating grass soup. Their parents were dying of starvation in the ruins of bombed cities. And here they were. The enemy was feeding them better than their own country ever had. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue. Others ate everything, driven by a hunger so deep it overrode shame and guilt. A few ate and cried at the same time, tears falling into their mashed potatoes, their bodies unable to choose between relief and anguish. The American soldiers watched from the edges of the room, their expressions unreadable. A few looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. One young soldier whispered to another, "They're crying. Should we do something?" "Just let them eat," the older soldier replied quietly. "They'll be okay." But would they? Keiko wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. The enemy was supposed to hate them. But this felt like something else entirely, and that was the most frightening thing of all. After the meal, the women were led to their barracks. They walked in a daze, their bellies full for the first time in months, their minds struggling to make sense of everything. The barracks were simple wooden buildings painted white, with small windows and neat rows of beds inside. Beds, not mats on the floor, not piles of straw. Actual beds with metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and folded blankets. Each bed had a small wooden trunk at its foot. The translator explained that they could keep their personal belongings in the trunks, that they could write letters home if they wished, that paper and pencils would be provided. Letters home. They could write to their families. Keiko chose a bed near the window and sat down slowly on the mattress. It was soft, not luxurious, but soft. She pressed her hand into it, feeling it give under her weight, then spring back. She hadn't slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years ago. Beside her, Yuki was running her hand over the wool blanket, her expression distant. "It's thick," she said softly. "It's winter in California, and they gave us thick blankets." Other women were exploring the barracks, opening trunks, testing beds, whispering to each other in voices filled with disbelief. At the end of the room, a small wood stove sat cold and ready. The translator explained that it would be lit in the evenings to keep them warm. Tomoko sat on her bed and buried her face in her hands. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Everything about this is wrong. We're prisoners. We're supposed to suffer. We're supposed to pay for what our country did. But instead..." She looked around the barracks, at the beds, the blankets, the windows with curtains. "Instead, they treat us like human beings." That night, as darkness fell and the lights were dimmed, the women lay in their beds, wrapped in their warm blankets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military base. Trucks rumbling in the distance, soldiers calling to each other in English, the low hum of generators. Outside, crickets chirped, and somewhere a radio played music, soft and jazzy and utterly foreign. Keiko pulled her blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Her body was warm, her stomach was full. She was clean. She was safe, and she had never felt more confused in her entire life. She thought of the propaganda films she had seen in Japan, the ones that showed Americans as monsters with no souls, no honor, no mercy. She thought of the officers who had told her that surrender meant torture and death. She thought of everything she had believed about the enemy. And then she thought of the soldier who had smiled at her on the dock, the nurse who had touched her shoulder with kindness. The chicken on her plate, the soap in her hands. Everything she knew was a lie, and that realization was more terrifying than any battle she had ever witnessed. The days took on a rhythm that felt surreal in its ordinariness. Every morning at 6:30 a bell rang across the camp, gentle and clear. The women woke, dressed in their simple gray dresses, and made their beds with military precision, a habit none of them could break, even as prisoners. Breakfast was served at 7 in the mess hall. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, fresh fruit, apples, oranges, sometimes bananas, coffee and milk. Every single morning this abundance appeared on their tables as if by magic. After breakfast, work assignments were given. But these weren't the brutal labor details they had expected. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, washing uniforms in large mechanical washers that did most of the work for them. Others worked in the kitchens, helping to prepare meals under the supervision of American cooks. A few with English skills were put to work, translating documents or teaching basic Japanese phrases to curious American soldiers. Keiko was assigned to the camp hospital, helping the nurses with basic tasks, folding bandages, organizing supplies, cleaning equipment. The work was light, almost gentle. She worked alongside 2 American nurses, Helen and Margaret, who treated her not as an enemy or a prisoner, but as a colleague. They showed her how to use the medical equipment, taught her English words for different supplies, and sometimes shared their lunches with her. The most shocking part? They were paid. Every Friday, each woman received small amounts of camp script, paper currency that could only be used in the camp, but was worth something nonetheless. With this money, they could visit the camp canteen, a small store stocked with items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, Nestle, Baby Ruth. The women stood in front of the candy display like children at a shrine, their eyes wide. Back in Japan, chocolate had disappeared years ago, reserved only for the military elite. Here, enemy prisoners could buy it with their labor wages: cigarettes, lipstick, hand lotion, pencils and notebooks, small bottles of perfume, handkerchiefs with embroidered flowers. These weren't necessities, these were luxuries, things that made life more than mere survival. Yuki bought a chocolate bar on her first visit to the canteen. She carried it back to the barracks like a treasure, unwrapping it slowly, breaking off one square at a time. The sweetness melted on her tongue, and she closed her eyes, savoring it. "I'm eating chocolate," she whispered to Keiko. "We're prisoners of war, and I'm eating chocolate." The routine continued. Lunch at noon, always hot, always substantial. Dinner at 6 and with meat at nearly every meal. In between, there were breaks, rest periods, even time for recreation. The Americans had set up a small library in one of the buildings, stocked with Japanese books they had somehow acquired. The women could check out books, read in their free time, discuss stories, with each other. On Sundays, there was no work. The women could rest, write letters, or attend religious services if they wished. A Buddhist chaplain visited once a month, and Christian services were available every week. The Americans accommodated both. This routine, this strange, gentle, almost domestic routine, began to wear down their resistance more effectively than any torture could have. Their bodies grew stronger. Color returned to their cheeks. They gained weight, their hollow faces filling out, their bones no longer pressing sharp against their skin. But with physical health came mental turmoil, because every day of comfort was also a day of guilt. Every meal was a reminder that their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal of everyone suffering back home, and yet they couldn't stop accepting it. They couldn't refuse the food, the warmth, the small kindnesses. They were trapped not by barbed wire, but by the paradox of an enemy who treated them better than their own country ever had. At night, the women gathered in small groups in the barracks, speaking in low voices, trying to make sense of it all. Some clung desperately to their old beliefs, insisting that this kindness was a trick, that the Americans were only being nice because they wanted information or cooperation. Others had begun to question everything they had been taught. The war was over. Japan had lost. And in losing, they had discovered something that shook them to their core. The enemy was not what they had been told. The enemy was something far more complicated, far more human, and far more frightening because of it. The letters from home arrived slowly, sometimes taking weeks or months to reach the camp. They came in thin envelopes, the paper worn and fragile, the handwriting shaky and desperate. Each letter was like a knife to the heart. Keiko's first letter from her mother arrived in late October. She sat on her bed in the evening light and opened it with trembling hands. The paper was so thin she could see through it. Her mother's handwriting, once elegant and precise, now wandered across the page in uneven lines. "My dear Keiko, we received word that you are alive and a prisoner in America. This brings me both relief and sorrow. Relief that you live, sorrow for what you must endure. Tokyo is gone. Our house is rubble. Your father and I live in a shelter made from sheets of metal. We eat once a day if we are lucky. Today we had rice water and a few leaves of cabbage. Your little brother grows thinner each week. He asks about you constantly. He remembers you bringing him sweets before the war. There are no sweets now. There is hardly anything. But we are alive, and that is enough. I hope you are being treated fairly. I hope you are not suffering too much. We pray for you every night. Your loving mother." Keiko read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking harder with each reading. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her trunk. That night she couldn't eat dinner. She stared at the roast beef and carrots on her plate and saw her little brother's thin face. She pushed the plate away and went back to the barracks. She wasn't alone. All around her, women were receiving similar letters. Letters describing starvation, homelessness, desperation. One woman's husband had died of malnutrition. Another's parents had been killed when their neighborhood was firebombed. A third received word that her children had been sent to live with relatives in the countryside because there was no food in the cities. The contrast became unbearable. Here in California, the camp was surrounded by abundance. Beyond the fences, American towns bustled with life. Stores were open and full of goods. Children played in parks. Families drove cars down clean streets lined with houses that had never been bombed. The women could see it when they were taken outside the camp for work details. Life continuing, normal and untouched, as if the war had happened on another planet. Yuki worked in a field one day, harvesting vegetables alongside other prisoners. At lunchtime, the American guard supervising them opened his metal lunchbox and shared his sandwiches with the women. He did this casually, as if it were nothing. Ham and cheese on white bread, wrapped in wax paper. He handed out sandwiches like a man feeding birds in a park, My wife makes extra, he explained through the translator. She knows you girls are hungry. His wife, a woman he had never met, had made sandwiches for enemy prisoners because she thought they might be hungry. Yuki took the sandwich with both hands, bowing, deeply, tears streaming down her face. That night she wrote in a journal she had started keeping. The guard's wife sent sandwiches. She doesn't know us. We were her enemies. Her country fought ours, and people died because of that. But she sent sandwiches. How am I supposed to hate people like this? How am I supposed to remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me? The physical transformation was impossible to hide. The women looked healthier than they had in years. Their skin glowed, their hair shone. They had flesh on their bones again. When they caught their reflections in windows or mirrors, they hardly recognized themselves. Tomoko stood in front of a mirror in the washroom one morning, staring at her own face. I look like I did before the war, she whispered. I look healthy. I look fed. She touched her cheek, feeling the softness there, the absence of sharp bone. Then she thought of her children's gaunt faces in the last photograph she had received, and she turned away from the mirror, unable to look at herself anymore. The guilt was crushing. To be well fed while your family starved. To sleep in a warm bed while your parents lived in rubble. To eat chocolate while your children foraged for grass to boil in water. This was a torture more sophisticated than any beating. This was the torture of being shown mercy when you believed you deserved punishment, of being treated with dignity when you expected cruelty, of discovering that everything you had been taught about honor, sacrifice, and enemies was a lie, and the lie cut deeper than any blade. It was the small moments that undid them, the casual kindnesses that made no sense, the brief encounters that cracked open their carefully constructed walls of hatred and fear. Keiko was carrying a stack of folded linens to the hospital one afternoon when she tripped on an uneven floorboard. The linens flew everywhere, white sheets scattering across the hallway floor. She dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to gather them, her face burning with shame. In Japan, such clumsiness would have earned her a sharp rebuke, maybe worse. But instead of anger, she heard laughter. Not mocking laughter, but warm, gentle laughter. She looked up to see one of the American doctors, a young man named Captain Miller, grinning at her as he knelt down to help. Happens to everyone, he said in English, which she didn't understand. But his tone was clear. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even annoyed. He was just helping. Together they gathered the sheets. When they were done, he handed her the stack and gave her a mock salute, still smiling. Then he walked away, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. Keiko stood in the hallway for a full minute, holding the sheets, trying to understand what had just happened. An officer, an American officer, had knelt on the floor to help her, an enemy prisoner, pick up laundry, and then he had smiled at her. Who were these people? Another day, Yuki was walking back from the fields when she heard music. She followed the sound to an open window in one of the American barracks. Inside, a group of young soldiers were gathered around a phonograph, listening to a jazz record and laughing. One of them saw her standing outside and waved her closer. You like music? He asked through gestures, since neither spoke the other's language. Yuki nodded hesitantly. The soldier disappeared inside and returned a moment later with the record. He handed it to her. Gift, he said, using one of the few Japanese words he knew. Purizento. She stared at the record in her hands. Glenn Miller and his orchestra. She tried to hand it back, shaking her head, but the soldier refused. No, you keep it. For the girls in your barracks. That night the women gathered around as Yuki played the record on the small phonograph that had been provided for their recreation. The music filled the barracks, bright, brassy, utterly American. Some women frowned and turned away, unable to enjoy the music of their enemies, but others closed their eyes and swayed slightly, letting the rhythm wash over them. Music was music, regardless of where it came from. The most powerful moment came in November, when the first cold snap hit California. The women woke one morning to frost on the windows and their breath visible in the air. They huddled under their blankets, dreading the cold that they knew would seep into their bones. But at breakfast, the American commander made an announcement through the translator. We've ordered additional blankets and warm coats for all. Prisoners, they should arrive by next week. In the meantime, we've increased the coal for your stoves. Stay warm. That was all. No fanfare, no expectation of gratitude, just a simple statement that they had noticed the cold and were taking care of it. Tomoko sat at breakfast with tears streaming down her face. They notice when we're cold, she whispered to the women around her. The enemy notices when we're cold and brings us blankets. She thought of the winter her family had spent in Hiroshima 2 years earlier, before the bomb, when they had burned furniture to stay warm because the military had requisitioned all the coal. She thought of her children's blue lips and shivering bodies. She thought of how her own government had looked at its citizens and seen nothing but resources to be used and discarded. And here was the enemy, bringing blankets because prisoners might be cold. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. And it was in these small moments, the doctor helping with laundry, the soldier giving away his music, the commander ordering blankets, that their worldview began to crumble completely. Because how do you hate someone who treats you like a human being? How do you maintain your loyalty to a cause when the enemy shows you more care than your own leaders ever did? These questions haunted them, and there were no good answers. By December, the internal war raging within each woman had become more brutal than any external battle they had witnessed. Keiko lay awake most nights, staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks, her mind spinning in circles that never reached a conclusion. During the day, she worked in the hospital, helping the American nurses with their tasks. She had learned enough English now to understand basic commands and even engage in simple conversations. Nurse Helen had started teaching her medical terms, patiently repeating words until Keiko could pronounce them correctly. Yesterday, Helen had squeezed Keiko's shoulder and said, "You're a natural at this. You should be a nurse after the war." After the war. As if there was an after. As if Keiko had a future beyond this barbed wire, beyond this strange limbo of being an enemy who was treated like a guest. At night, she pulled out her mother's letters and read them by flashlight under her blanket. The words never changed, but they cut deeper each time. Hunger, cold, desperation. Her little brother growing weaker. Her father coughing blood because he had given his food ration to the children. And here she was, gaining weight, learning English, being called a natural by an American nurse. The guilt was physical. It sat in her chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. Every bite of food she took felt like a betrayal. Every warm night in her bed felt like a crime. She was living better than she ever had in Japan, better than most Japanese civilians had lived even before the war, and she was doing it in enemy captivity. What did that make her? A survivor? A traitor? Both? Neither? Yuki's struggle was different, but equally painful. She had been a dedicated patriot, a true believer in the Emperor and the cause of Greater East Asia. She had volunteered for military service, had believed every word of the propaganda, had been willing to die for Japan. But now every belief she had held was cracking apart. She had been told that Americans were racist, that they would treat Japanese people as subhuman. Yet every day she saw American soldiers treating them with a casual respect that made no sense within her worldview. She had been told that American culture was shallow and corrupt, yet she found herself humming the jazz melodies she heard on the radio. She had been told that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here she was, alive, clean, healthy, and the dishonor she felt had nothing to do with surrender and everything to do with how comfortable she had become. One evening she sat in the barracks with her journal open, trying to write her thoughts, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain this to herself, let alone anyone else? Finally, she wrote, "I have become the enemy, not because I am being held by Americans, but because I have started to see them as human. And in seeing them as human, I have betrayed everything I was taught. But if what I was taught was a lie, then what was I loyal to? What did I sacrifice for? And if the sacrifice was for nothing, then what am I?" The question hung there on the page, unanswered and unanswerable. Around them, other women were experiencing their own private crises. Some dealt with it by doubling down on their hatred, refusing to speak to the Americans, eating their food in bitter silence, taking the comfort but rejecting any human connection. These women sat apart from the others, their faces hard, their eyes cold. They would accept survival, but nothing more. Others went in the opposite direction, embracing their new reality with an enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. They learned English eagerly, laughed at the soldiers' jokes, listened to American music without guilt. They seemed to shed their Japanese identity like an old coat, wrapping themselves in American approval as if it could protect them from the darkness of what they had lost. But most women existed somewhere in between these extremes, torn, conflicted, unable to fully embrace either position. They were caught in a psychological no man's land, too changed to return to who they had been, but too Japanese to fully accept who they were becoming. The Americans, for their part, seemed oblivious to this internal struggle. They saw prisoners who were adjusting well, who were healthy and cooperative and even friendly. They didn't see the midnight tears, the guilt-ridden journals, the whispered conversations about loyalty and betrayal. Or maybe they did see it and simply didn't know what to do about it. Because how do you help someone whose entire worldview is collapsing? How do you comfort someone whose suffering comes not from cruelty but from kindness? The debates started quietly, in whispers after lights out. But as weeks passed, they grew louder, more heated, more desperate. The women needed to make sense of what was happening to them, and the only way to do that was to talk about it, to argue about it, to wrestle with it together. "We are still Japanese," insisted Fumiko, a former translator who had worked in the Philippines. She was one of the hardliners, refusing to learn English, refusing to smile at the Americans, eating her meals with her back to the guards. "Nothing they do changes who we are. They feed us because the Geneva Convention requires it, not because they care. This is all political theater. When we return to Japan, we will be judged by how we maintained our dignity in captivity." "What dignity?" Yuki shot back. Her voice was sharp, bitter. We were sent to war by men who promised us victory and glory. They gave us neither. They gave us starvation and defeat. And now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we're supposed to feel ashamed of that? I'm done being ashamed. You're being brainwashed, Fumiko snapped. This is exactly what they want, to make us forget who we are, to make us grateful, to make us complicit. Complicit in what? Keiko asked quietly. She was sitting on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest. The war is over. Japan lost. What exactly are we being complicit in by accepting food and shelter? In our own humiliation, Fumiko said. In the narrative that America is the merciful victor and we are the grateful defeated. In the lie that they are better than us. Maybe they are better than us, said a young woman named Sachiko. She was only 19, had been a clerk in a medical unit. Maybe not better, but different. I was taught that Americans had no honor, no respect for human life. But I've seen more respect here than I ever saw in the Imperial Army. I watched officers beat soldiers for minor infractions. I watched commanders send men to certain death and call it glory. Here I see soldiers who joke with each other, who treat their officers like human beings, who follow orders but don't worship them. That's not weakness. That's something else. It's democracy, Tomoko said softly. She was the oldest woman in the barracks, in her late 30s, and her words carried weight. I read about it before the war, in books that were later banned. The idea that people can question authority, that leaders serve the people instead of the other way around. I thought it was a fantasy. But watching these Americans, I think maybe it's real. Democracy didn't stop them from dropping atomic bombs on our cities, Fumiko countered coldly. Democracy didn't stop them from firebombing Tokyo, from killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Don't romanticize them just because they're nice to us now. Silence fell over the barracks, because Fumiko was right and everyone knew it. The same country that gave them chocolate and blankets had also unleashed destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. How could both things be true? How could Americans be capable of such kindness and such cruelty? Maybe, Yuki said slowly, that's what makes them powerful. They can do both. They can destroy their enemies completely and then treat them with mercy afterward. That's not weakness. That's strength. Terrifying strength. The conversations continued night after night, never reaching resolution. Generational divides emerged. Older women who remembered Japan before militarism took over were more willing to question what they had been taught. Younger women who had grown up with propaganda struggled more to let go of their beliefs. Some women stopped participating in the debates altogether, retreating into silence, unwilling to confront the questions that had no good answers. Others became obsessed with the debates, arguing for hours, as if finding the right words could somehow make sense of the senseless. But beneath all the arguments, beneath all the intellectual wrestling, was a simple, devastating truth that every woman felt but few could articulate. They had been lied to. About the enemy, about the war, about what loyalty and honor meant. The lies had cost them everything, their homes, their families, their sense of identity. And now they were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered worldview, trying to build something new from the rubble. It was exhausting, it was painful, and it was necessary, because they couldn't go forward until they acknowledged the truth, and they couldn't go back to what they had been before. They were trapped in the transformation, and the only way out was through. The turning point came in late December, when the camp organized a Christmas celebration. The women watched in fascination as the Americans decorated a large tree in the recreation hall with lights, ornaments, and a star on top. They had never seen anything like it. The commander announced through the translator that the prisoners were invited to attend the Christmas party. There would be special food, music, and gifts. Gifts for prisoners of war. Most of the women attended out of curiosity. They sat in rows of chairs, watching as American soldiers performed songs and skits. Some of the entertainment was clearly meant to be funny, though the humor didn't always translate. But the Americans were trying. They were putting on a show for their prisoners, trying to give them joy. Then came the gifts. Each woman received a small wrapped package. Keiko opened hers with trembling hands and found inside a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar. Simple things. Practical things. But wrapped in bright paper with a ribbon as if they were precious. She stared at the gifts in her lap and felt something break inside her. Not break in a painful way, but break open, like a seed cracking to let new growth emerge. These weren't lavish gifts. They weren't trying to buy her loyalty or gratitude. They were just human. One human giving another human something small and kind because it was Christmas. That's when Keiko understood. The Americans weren't treating them well because of some calculated political strategy. They weren't following the Geneva Convention out of fear or obligation. They were doing it because this was simply how they treated people. Even enemies, even prisoners, even Japanese women they had been at war with weeks earlier. This was the dangerous truth. American power came not just from bombs and bullets, but from the idea that every person had value. that even your enemy deserved basic dignity. That victory didn't require cruelty. This was the ideology they had been fighting against. The idea that individuals mattered more than the collective, that human rights existed regardless of nationality or loyalty. And it worked. It was working on them right now. Every meal, every blanket, every small kindness was a demonstration of this philosophy. You could destroy us with your armies, these actions said, but we'll rebuild you with our mercy. We'll show you that there's a better way. Yuki sat beside Keiko, holding her own wrapped gifts, tears streaming down her face. It's not a weapon, she whispered. It's just who they are. That's what makes it so devastating. Around them, other women were crying too. Not sad tears, but something more complicated. Tears of release, maybe? Tears of recognition. Tears of grieving for the beliefs they had held and the sacrifices they had made for those beliefs. Tomoko stood up, walked to the front of the room, and bowed deeply to the American commander. The room fell silent. Through the translator, she said, "Thank you for treating us like human beings. We didn't expect this. We were taught to expect cruelty, but you have shown us something different, something we don't fully understand yet, but we are grateful." The commander looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, shifting his weight, his face slightly red. "We're just following the rules, ma'am," he said. "Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of POWs. We're not doing anything special." But they were. They absolutely were. Because following rules that protected even your enemies, treating prisoners with dignity even when your own people had died at their hands, choosing mercy when you could choose vengeance, that was everything. That was the whole point. As the party continued, something shifted in the barracks. The hardliners became fewer. The debates became quieter. A collective exhaustion settled over the women, the exhaustion of resistance finally crumbling. They couldn't maintain their hatred in the face of this relentless humanity. They couldn't cling to propaganda that called Americans demons when those demons were giving them Christmas presents. They couldn't remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them when the enemy was the only thing keeping them alive. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take years, maybe decades, for some women to fully process what had happened to them. But in that moment, in that decorated hall with a Christmas tree and wrapped gifts and American soldiers singing carols, something fundamental changed. They began to see their captors not as the enemy, but as people. Flawed people, certainly. People capable of terrible things, definitely. But people nonetheless. And in seeing that, they began to question everything else they had been taught. The most dangerous weapon America possessed wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the simple, radical idea that human dignity transcended national boundaries. And that weapon was working exactly as designed. The mirror moment came in January 1946 on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Keiko was working in the hospital, organizing medical supplies in a storage room, when she caught sight of her reflection in a glass cabinet door. She stopped moving, stared, didn't recognize herself at first. The woman in the reflection had round cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes, healthy hair that shone even in the dim storage room light. She looked young again, alive. The hollow, haunted look that had defined her face for the last 2 years of war was completely gone. She looked like she had before the war. No, she looked better than she had before the war. Because even in peacetime Japan, she had never eaten this well, never had access to this level of medical care, never been this healthy. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself. Keiko's hands began to shake. She braced herself against the cabinet, her breath coming in short gasps. Because in that moment, seeing her own healthy reflection, the full weight of the betrayal crashed over her. Not betrayal by the Americans, betrayal by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her health, her innocence, and used them as fuel for a war machine. Japan had fed her propaganda instead of food, had given her ideology instead of medicine, had demanded her sacrifice while offering nothing in return. Japan had told her that suffering was noble, that hunger was honorable, that dying for the emperor was the highest calling. All lies. All of it lies. Because here she stood, a prisoner of war, healthier and happier than she had ever been as a free citizen of the empire. Here she stood, fed and clothed and treated with dignity by the very people she had been taught to fear and hate. The Americans hadn't broken her with cruelty. They had broken her with the truth that she was worth feeding, worth caring for, worth treating like a human being. And that truth demolished everything she thought she knew about loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cabinet, and sobbed. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and wounded. She cried for the girl she had been, who had believed the propaganda. She cried for the years she had wasted serving a cause that had never valued her. She cried for her family still suffering in Japan, still trapped in the lie. She cried for all the people who had died believing that their sacrifice meant something, when really they had just been fuel for men who didn't care about them at all. Nurse Helen found her there 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Keiko's face and understood, somehow without words. She sat down on the floor beside her, not touching her, not trying to fix it, just sitting with her in her grief. "It's okay," Helen said softly, even though Keiko barely understood English. "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to grieve for that." Keiko looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This woman, this American woman who had every reason to hate her, whose country had been at war with hers, who had probably lost friends or family to Japanese bullets, was sitting on a hospital floor, offering comfort to an enemy prisoner who was having a breakdown. And in that moment, Keiko's worldview didn't just crack. It shattered completely. She understood now. This was what democracy looked like. This was what it meant to believe that every individual had inherent worth, regardless of which side of a war they were on. This was the philosophy that Japan had been fighting against, the idea that human rights weren't granted by emperors or earned through sacrifice, but simply existed because humans existed. Japan had lost the war. But more than that, Japan's entire ideology had been proven hollow. Because when you put the two systems side by side, one that treated humans as tools for the state, and one that recognized humans as individuals with dignity, the difference was undeniable. She thought of her little brother in Tokyo, starving. She thought of the American soldier yesterday who had shared his lunch with her. She thought of the emperor in his palace, untouched by the suffering of his people. She thought of the American commander ordering extra blankets for cold prisoners. The comparison was devastating and undeniable. That evening, Keiko stood in the barracks and spoke to the assembled women. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I saw myself in a mirror today," she said. "I looked healthy. And I realized that I look better now, as a prisoner, than I ever did as a free citizen of Japan. And that's not because America is perfect. It's because Japan failed us. Completely and utterly failed us." She looked around the room at faces both sympathetic and resistant. "I'm not saying we should forget who we are. I'm not saying we should become American. But I am saying that we need to acknowledge the truth. We were lied to. About the war, about the enemy, about what our country